Hi, I'm Joni Mihura, and I'm going to be presenting this 1-hour webinar specifically on moving from Exner's comprehensive system to RPAS, what has changed and why. I have to say also, because I'm a co-developer of RPAS, I have a disclosure statement that I'm part owner of the company that also produces a test manual and some associated products, excuse me. And also for the casebook here, I've received some royalties from Guilford. I'm a professor at the University of Toledo, and I teach personality assessment. I'm board certified in assessment psychology. I'm a fellow and a former president of the Society for Personality Assessment. I was a member of John Exner's Rorschach Research, that's a tongue twister, Research Council that I will talk a little bit more about in later slides, and of course an RPAS developer. TPAS is an in-progress version of the Rorschach that will just be to assess for, excuse me, psychosis. I've authored systematic reviews and meta-analyses for over 70 variables, resulting in the critics lifting their call for an all-out moratorium on the Rorschach. You see some books below that either I am the editor or author that are either published or in progress. This is a list of the current RPAS team. I won't read through all these names, but just to say these were the original developers. Bob Erard, unfortunately, unexpectedly passed away some years ago. And we have a new author, Luciano Germani from Italy. We have from the US, and we have representation from other countries as well. So what is RPAS? RPAS was developed by members of Exner's Council as a revision and a replacement for the CS, including changes that we started working with him on before his death in 2006. The test manual published in the online scoring ready in 2011. You can see information here is our website. RPAS has over 7,400 active online users in 59 countries. I showed you earlier the casebook illustrating interpretation, and a recent survey of in this summer of 2022 to update my survey in 2015 of APA accredited clinical psychology doctoral programs. We found that of those programs that teach the Rorschach, 77% were training their students in RPAS. We've presented over 190 presentations in many countries and US cities. And contemporarily, for training and research, like what do we find? RPAS was published in 2011, and how have doctoral programs responded? I summarized that earlier. In 2015, though, in our survey, 4 years after RPAS was published, of the 63 programs teaching the Rorschach, 59% were teaching RPAS, and 84% were teaching the CS, and 43% were teaching both. Why, might you ask? A lot of the reason that we've heard from programs is that there are internships that are still teaching the comprehensive system that they needed to train their students in. So 11 years later, this survey we did this summer, of the 55 programs that were teaching the Rorschach, now 77% were teaching RPAS and less were teaching the CS. 27% were still teaching both. Comparing this to 11 years after the comprehensive system was published in 1974, a survey found that 71% of doctoral programs were updated to teach the comprehensive system. So it's a very similar sort of 11 years later transition. We find that with personality assessment instruments, often it takes a while for people to transfer over to the newer versions. Also, contemporary research, one place you can look for that for assessment research is the Society for Personality Assessment. In 2001, it encompassed some 2020 presentations that were canceled because of the pandemic. So we have more presentations here overall than usual for 2 years. So 21 and 22, there were 47 presentations that were including RPAS research, and 6 presentations were presenting comprehensive system research. So on the next slides, I have a brief overview of the who, what, when, where, and why of RPAS. This is just a 1-hour overview, and we have many webinars and workshops coming up. And so, you can learn more, but I'm just going to give you an overview. So who developed RPAS? Exner passed away in February of 2006, and he willed his test to his family, who were not psychologists. His son, as I'll show you later, or as I guess it says it on the next bulleted list here, he worked for Rorschach workshops. But Exner had said earlier that he was going to have the research council that he formed to take over the developments of the comprehensive system. And I'll say more about that council that was started in 1997. But at the time of his death, 4 RPAS developers were on his council: Greg Meyer, Don Villeon, myself, and Phil Erdberg. And so we expected to be able to move forward. For example, he was collecting norms, and we knew that there were many things that I'm going to talk about on later slides here that we had in progress that we expected. Like, we knew there were some problems, we knew some things that needed to be fixed, we knew there were improvements on the way, and we couldn't do that to the comprehensive system because after 3 years of 4 of the council members discussing moving forward with the family, mainly so that not all of us showed up. It was 2, Phil and Greg, who had known the family the longest. We discussed with Doris, Exner's wife, and his son, Christopher, who had worked for Rorschach workshops when we were discussing with them. After 3 years, they decided they wanted to leave the test as it was for his legacy. I have some more specifics about that on later slides. So we were completely not prepared for this. So we continued the work that we'd started with Exner, plus some other improvements, and added a forensic psychologist, Bob Erard, who I mentioned earlier. RPAS was then developed as a revision and a replacement of the comprehensive system, but it had to be different enough and have a different name for copyright. We also didn't want to be taking from the comprehensive system that was the family's now. The last DS edition, Volume 1, was in 2003. RPAS was published in 2011, but we never intended to be test developers. So this was completely on top of our academic jobs and Phil Erdberg's clinical work. But we were Exner's council members, and we're already working on the changes. And, we were in a really unique position to see and to know what changes he was envisioning, what work needed to be done. There were lots and lots of discussions that went into the changes, and a lot of reviewing things and looking at the research. And we felt, though, a strong responsibility because we knew some of the problems with the comprehensive system on which we were working on solutions, and we knew we wanted to be able to address them. So this here is, it's an excerpt from Exner's, he had alumni newsletters for many years. And here in later slides, I have in purple, the purple kind of ties the council work and early Exner work to RPAS moving forward. So you can sort of see a connection, and then I'll switch and just put it in the context of RPAS changes from the CS. As he said in his newsletter, he developed the council in 1997. The basic mission of the council was to evaluate the literature for the various things in this list that I won't read through now. And as he said in the end, the council will ultimately have the responsibility for the continued development of the comprehensive system. This is excerpts from Christopher Exner's letter that he sent to the Rorschach community. He sent it to a discussion list. He sent it and had asked people to forward it to everybody because he wanted everybody to know the position of he and his mother, Doris. And there's a lot more in it than this, which we plan to share with people eventually, but we just recently decided to share it. I'll say a little bit more why later, but here's some excerpts from it. Dear Rorschach community, Greg and Phil have engaged in conversations with my mother and me about changing my father's books for about 3 years. During these discussions, it became clear that we, my mother and I, did not possess the specific knowledge about current Rorschach research to approve revisions to any of my father's writings. Additionally, we had also accepted my father's position that the CS is a mature, well-functioning system. He wrote in the preface to the 5th edition of the workbook, the system now appears to stand about as complete as possible. He goes on to say the basic tenet of Greg and company, they have also stated in their email announcements, is the need to have a system that has vitality and can evolve and be responsive to current and future Rorschach research findings, This should not, he goes on to say, this should not diminish my father's work or his contributions to the Rorschach or suggest the CS is no longer a viable approach to the test. They're in no way attempting to impugn the work of my father. He's saying this also because he had heard from many people that they felt that we were somehow criticizing Exner and were somehow against Exner, but we were his research council, and he said he was going to leave the test to us. And so Christopher's making this statement to say, look, we're talking with them. This is not to attack my father's work. And in fact, we were the people he chose to be on his council. So as I have said before, no one can claim to know what direction my father would have taken his work. And that's the thing that they were very concerned about. Finally, my mother and I harbor, he ends the email this way, no ill will against Greg, Phil, Don, Joni, or Robert in their endeavor and wish them well. We've asked on them on several occasions, how can we help? We are not arrogant and understand that my father's words are not the be-all, end-all on the Rorschach. They are, however, and will remain his own. And I'm going to come back to this in a little bit about the comprehensive system and Exner's writings in his words. So as a brief overview from our past changes from the comprehensive system, we moved forward the council's work with Exner to improve the system. We revised a little bit of administration. We added the new variables we've been discussing. There was a review of the literature to see if it supported the CS variables. It also became clear that Exner's norms for many CS variables were notably off, and I'll show more about that in a later and give you some references, but we were initially sort of defensively protecting the norms and thought that it was a mistake, but as sort of new norms and new information rolled in, it became clear that its norms were off, in particular in some ways that I'll show you. Also, many CS variables validity were not supported in the systematic reviews and meta-analyses that have informed the RPAS variable selection. And another thing I'll say a little bit more about with a reference, the CS test manual also unfortunately contains numerous errors that are all in the direction of supporting the test, actually all but one. And so it artificially inflates the perceived validity of the scores. And that definitely sounds like a criticism of Exner's manual, and it is, and it is based on reviewing the research that's in there, and I'll refer to that later. So now in John's 2000 alumni letter, the projects that eventually became part of RPAS are in purple. I'm just going to read these now. I'll say more about them later so I can try to keep this to 60 minutes. The issue of R, meaning low and high number of responses, and some procedures of administration relating to R, the ego impairment index, the aggressive content variable, concerns about inner score reliability, the critical stimulus features of the plots, questions about the normative data, applications of the EII, and the matter of high lambda records. So, oops. Sorry. All right, I'm on the right slide. So these are also some examples of RPES changes that were underway, even in Exner's test manual that you'll read. The first one is the food response. Exner, when you look that up in his test manual, look up the food response. I'll give you the pages here. He recommends the Rorschach oral dependence score, which we call oral dependency language, because it's based on the language, the words that are used, not the images. There's been a review and meta-analysis by Bob Bornstein, who's done a lot of work on this scale, but the comprehensive system didn't have norms for it. So it's the Rorschach is complicated. Sometimes you change one thing and there's a lot of other things that need to be changed before it can all go into effect. So the DEPI, the depression index, if you read about it in his manual, he has a lot of cautions about its use and some ideas of what he thinks it might measure. But in two meta-analyses, including the one of my own and my colleagues, it was not supported for assessing clinical depression. So a summary of the RPES changes to the CS, sort of from the perspective of the council and working with John Exner, and sort of how they link with his council minutes and newsletters. He talked about the problem of R. I'll say a little bit more about this later, but R optimized administration asks for 2, maybe 3 responses. It takes 4, but it doesn't go to 5 like the CS does. The original Dean study that was designed to assess an early, very similar version of what we call R-opt for short, was co-developed with John Exner. We had many discussions about what to do about this wide variability of R that could result in wide standard deviations and some error. The questions about the norms, RPES uses newer international norms, and we're currently collecting new contemporary norms. What about high lambda? We give the potential for what we call complexity. The variable called complexity is based on the first factor of the Rorschach, to adjust protocols by complexity if you wish. We're reviewing the literature, the systematic reviews and meta-analyses that I mentioned earlier, informed RPES, and we added the other scores that I had mentioned that in one way or another the council had been working on. In sum, therefore, RPES was planned as a revision and a replacement of Exner's comprehensive system by his own council members after his death. Many changes from the CS to RPES were then already in the works before Exner died. So what are the changes resulting in RPES as a substantial improvement over the CS? So here and in other places, I also have many references that support some of the statements I make. Some places I won't have references on every slide because it's very busy, but in some of these summaries, I will include references that you can find at the end of this PowerPoint. It uses an empirically based selection of variables based on systematic validity reviews and meta-analyses. It fixes the errors in Exner's norms, and more accurate, more recent, and international. Reduces the variation in R and virtually eliminates the need for readministration. Like virtually, like even with very severe populations like schizophrenia patients who have been inpatient for a long time, or forensic settings. Some references here. And interpretation is more efficient and credible, I like to say, especially credible to people first learning the test, like students. I'll say more about that later. We use standard scores instead of the raw scores that are used in the CS. And interpretation is based on the response process, which just kind of makes sense. I'll talk a little bit about that later. Now, if you look at this, just a really brief overview from the view of the CS, what does this mean? One, If you use Exner's norms, you'll over-pathologize your clients on many personality and psychopathology characteristics, especially the form quality, visual misperceptions, part of psychosis symptoms. And you'll infer that your clients have more limited psychological resources. The CS also now includes many scores that we know aren't valid for interpretation of the proposed constructs. And we have these errors that I'll show you a little bit more about later in the CS Volume 1 manual and the excerpt review of the literature. And on subsequent slides, there's more information about this. And so up to now, just giving you an overview, I'm going to provide more details about some of these things. And then on the very last slide, I'm going to show you some free resources for people who have accounts, which are also free to have. And especially for people teaching, we have some free resources for them. This is just, excuse me. This is just a figure taken from an article that is here in the reference section that compares the international norms to Exner's 2003 and 2007 norms. And so you'll see that this slide here, you can't read all the details of the variables, but I'll just say that this is the slide that reports the mediation variables, which are the form quality variables, which are notably different. And so Exner's means that he provides for the form quality variables, the form quality minus means, the X minus percent are too low. And so the form quality ordinary are also too high. RPAS is currently using model norms for adults, and new norms are coming out soon. We're at about 900 now. That includes also some children and adolescent ones to update the children norms that we already have. And we also have this research support here in these citations supporting using these modeling of our optimized administration. We also require a high bar for people who are collecting data, because there have been a lot of criticisms of other norms saying, oh, well, they're more simplistic or they're different because the people administering, they didn't know how to administer, maybe they weren't as skilled. So we require both administration and scoring proficiency for our normative data collectors. And if you are or know anybody who has one, knows that it's really, you really need to know what you're doing to be able to collect norms for us. So on the subsequent slides have a little bit more about meta-analyses, but I want to say first, just actually two things here. I'm trying not to run over my time. We're talking way too fast. Prior to the meta-analyses of the individual variables, there were what are called global meta-analyses that showed overall the validity of the Rorschach was on par with the MMPIs. And so global meta-analyses, they go in and they sort of take a random sample of the validity literature, which is lots from each of these tests, and they say overall the test in general has about this level of validity. And so this is summarized in Meyer and Archer 2001, finding that the validity was on par, the Rorschach and the MMPI. But a little bit about the meta-analyses, especially for people who are trainers, I think might find this interesting. We didn't initially plan to conduct these large meta-analyses, but I started teaching projectives here at the University of Toledo in 1996 when the flurry of criticism started. In 1999, Howard Garb called for a moratorium. In 2003, the Rorschach critics published a popular press book entitled What's Wrong with the Rorschach? So initially, you know, there were reasons why these things were different and maybe the norms weren't off and such. But over time, I got like very concerned about my students and what they were interpreting for their clients. There was a variable or two already that I had seen didn't have support in the literature. I knew the deputy hadn't had support in the literature, and then here it was, I was teaching it. And what do I say about that? So I really, for a few months, just got, I couldn't even sleep some nights. I was so worried about what to do. I thought, I'm either going to have to stop teaching this test, or I decided I'm going to have to figure it out for myself. which variables are valid and which aren't. So I started reviewing the literature. There are a lot of findings in one article. I started organizing it in an Excel file. Then in 2005, as I'm working through this, John Exner asked me to join his research council. I was the only woman who was ever on his council. I have some womanly pride about that. So the systematic reviews and meta-analyses, which took 6 years and over 4,000 hours, they were finished in 2011. They were my contribution to the comprehensive system. Otherwise, I would have included some other variables. So I was doing this as my part to review the literature as we said that we would. This is the reference for it in Psychological Bulletin. As I said, it was complete in November 2011, and so we had an early version of it, was informed the RPAS test manual variables with myself and Greg Meyer and two of my previous students who were psychologists at the time it was published. Meta-analyses of the 68 major CS variables. I'm going to not read everything on here because you can read it in the article, but we made sure that we had inter-rater reliability on our decisions. We had to show that Rorschach researchers weren't biased in making hypotheses after they saw the results. How can you figure that out? Well, we did find a way that Psychological Bulletin accepted as a good way to show it, and as it turned out, there was no evidence of bias in what one of my students, who is an author on there, George Bombell, liked to call post hoc hypotheses. You see your results and you say, oh, I should have hypothesized that. So overall, there were what contributed to externally assessed criterion variables. We separated self-report and externally assessed because we want to show, if you're going to use the Rorschach, you want to show that it gives you something other than self-report, either a new construct or additional variance on a construct. And so we found like a small overall validity effect size for self-report associations and a medium effect size, which is what is expected in the cross-method psychological validity literature based on 770 findings, but that's an overall. So the variables that had low validity, were treated differently than the variables that had higher validity. This is a summary in that article that we had to come up with a way to say, here's what counts as validity evidence, the strength of the evidence at these different levels of support, which we classified based on, you can read the article, but based on the effect size, the alpha level, and the fail-safe in, so like how robust were these findings. You'll see down here, little to no evidence, and studies that didn't have validity in the published literature. And as I will show you later, it's not that we just overlooked or excluded it, but Exner also doesn't have any for these variables in the published literature in his volume 1. What's the bottom line for Wood et al.? You can read this, but what did they conclude? Previously, they had said every single meta-analysis was flawed. So I was very, very concerned about what they were going to say, what they're going to review, if they were going to find errors. I checked things, rechecked things, had students recheck things. And we went through lots of reviews, and we had 3 really good reviewers. Basically, they did not find that we made any errors or that we had bias in our decisions. And for the variables that they saw that were supported, they recommended removing the moratorium. As I clarified later on a listserv, we didn't say remove the moratorium for the whole Rorschach, and we also don't say that. And so they, you can read also my response. They conducted some meta-analyses, but they made a lot of errors. And so we have a reply. So when you do a systematic review and meta-analyses, you don't just look at articles, you look at other reviews of the literature. One of those reviews, of a few different reviews, was of course Exner's review of the literature in his volume 1. I don't know how many people have read through all the literature. I found it very interesting. I read through it many times. I remembered it when I was teaching. I have notes in it. But unfortunately, what I found was that there are a lot of errors in there. And some studies I thought, oh, either I overlooked, but no, it turned out there were some studies that didn't have the results he reported in them. There were many other studies that the results were in the opposite direction of what he was reporting. And I already knew that for many of them because I'd reviewed those. So we were very careful about reviewing this. We included on Open Science Framework, you can see all of our decisions. I don't know who's ever looked at that, but in case you want to look at it, in general, in the Comprehensive System Manual, he reports of the peer-reviewed validity studies, he reports 206 as supportive and 16 as non-supportive, but when you look them up, in actuality, there's 131 supportive, 52 non-supportive, and 51 that actually aren't in the articles that he cites. There's a greater number in the second set. You can read more about that in this article. But there were some non-supportive findings for 7 variables that he hadn't included from the article that he cited, so we included those. So interestingly enough, as we show in this article, these results were much more like the results in the meta-analysis. Once you corrected the errors, it looks a lot like the meta-analyses for like which variables were supported and which weren't. Also, one of the things, I'll say a little bit more in this next slide, but just in terms of the total number of CS-coded validity findings from the peer-reviewed journals, those that are included in the Mihura et al. Meta-analyses, there were a total of 1,156. In Exner's test manual, there are 50. So one of the things that people have said is that, well, ARPAS relies on research that also is done using the comprehensive system. Isn't that a problem? Well, we are conducting, and other people are conducting research, as I'll show you later, with ARPAS, but Exner also relies a lot on studies with previous systems. And I summarize that in this article, and you can see for what variables and how much and what kind. But as I said earlier, Exner also didn't find published validity studies for the 12 variables that we didn't. And he also didn't for 22 other variables. He doesn't cite any published validity studies. Therefore, he doesn't cite published validity studies for his manual for 34 of his 68 test variables. And for 8 of those other test variables, he cites published research, but they're not using CS-coded variables. Therefore, he cites published validity studies using the CS variables for only 26 of his 68 test variables. So Exner, like we do, and we feel like we made our variables to be like the CS variables. And just like he did, he expected other systems that were coded in the same way to be applicable. He also changed coding over time, and the earlier studies from his earlier volumes applies to his later volumes, just like the CS applies to what we don't call the CS, but ARPAS. So, I just want to say that it's not common to have construct validity meta-analyses for the scales of psychological tests. The critics said that the Rorschach needed that for individual scales. But if you look at the MMPI and the PAI, how many construct validity meta-analyses exist for their clinical scales? For the MMPI and some for the PAI, there are many faking studies, asking people to fake good or fake bad or fake a certain way, summarizing the validity. But for the clinical scales or the content scales, there's only 2 for depression scales, scale 2 and the depression content scale, which are not on the RF or the 3, and the PAI for the clinical scales, they have 0. So it's a pretty high bar to ask for validity meta-analyses. And as I can tell you, it is very time consuming. Okay, there, I need to go here. So this is a slide which I summarized some of what I told you I would summarize some. The studies comparing ARPAS and the CS, The Rorschach is known for being good for assessing psychosis, has 2 meta-analyses on that. Even the critics say many times it's good for assessing psychosis. And so we've had several studies finding that the RPAS is more reliable and valid than the CS, especially for assessing psychosis and severe psychopathology. And that's not just the norms. We also have a lot of like neurophysio techniques like fMRI, EEG. There's a recent forensic review in JPA for using the Rorschach in forensic settings, came out just recently. It's an open access article. It's cited at the end of the PowerPoints, and it's focused specifically on RPAS. So in addition to being informed by meta-analyses, what are other RPAS differences from the CS? So just kind of summarize overall, when you're learning RPAS, here's some of the things that you'll be learning. And first, I will say, some of these are going to be a little hard to learn at first. You're used to using certain codes. We've changed some of the code names, but we did that specifically because one of the main things that we're concerned about are the new users. And doctoral programs are so overwhelmed now with training students. And so the training and a lot of assessment has reduced. And we wanted to make it as easy as possible. We're focused on the wellspring of new learners. So for example, MC for human movement and color, it kind of links it back to what's scored in it rather than EA, M over MC rather than EB. I also want to say that we surveyed experienced clinicians to learn what scores they found important in their practice, and we summarized that also in the test manual. This is just a list that I'm not going to have time to get through this in 60 minutes to read through everything. I've mentioned all of these before, except prompts and polls, asking for another response if they just give one. If they give 4, asking for the card back. We also plot that. We plot card turning so you can see how your client compares to other people. Critical contents, I didn't mention that. It's very similar to the trauma content index and dramatic content. We've separated space into space reversal and space integration. These used to be 2 different scores. Rorschach himself just scored what we call space reversal for oppositionality. You can read about it in this cited article. These are variables that are excluded either because they weren't supported in the literature, they have a high overlap with another score, or like the obsessive style index wasn't studied because how often is that? It's hardly ever elevated. So it was a very, very low base rate. You can see in the appendix of the RPAS manual what's coded, is coded and isn't coded at the level of the codes. So you'll see, for example, because there wasn't research supporting this, because Exner didn't have this as a step in the manual to interpret the form dominance of shading and achromatic color, there weren't studies on it. Also, same for color naming and studies. So we've dropped that. We did include it for color because there is research on the color dominance scores. The isolation index wasn't supported, and so we have also dropped that. You can use this in the appendix as kind of a guide to see what is and isn't scored. Then you can look at it from the structural summary to look at the scores that you interpret. The ones that we've crossed out here, or I've crossed out here, are not in RPAS. The box means that they've been revised, but they're still in RPAS, like we separate space into 2 different kinds of space responses. As I mentioned, the R optimized changes to maybe 3 responses. It results in tighter standard deviation, so it constructs the targets, targets the constructs better. Whew. It also, as I mentioned, reduces the range and scheduling administration time, which, if, as you may know, sometimes can go to 50 responses and you didn't save enough time. But it also virtually eliminates re-administration, as I mentioned before. And even though it's very, very rare, if you do have to administer, we have different guidelines. if there are less than 16 responses, instead of administering the whole thing again, and then the client doesn't know, do I use the same responses? What do I do? And they're frustrated, and you're frustrated. We retain the original responses, and for cards that have less than 4 responses, we ask if they can see anything else. We also change the form quality entries. I'm not going to go into detail on this, but we also have like fit ratings by 10 different people for every single content, in terms of, like, if you look at it and you make the judgment of whether it fits, you get averaged over 10 people. And we have information from the internationally collected norms on form quality that inform the RPAS form quality tables. On the next slide, you can see we've reorganized the form quality content. So, for example, this bold, they're all human contents. And below this, bold and italics would be human-like contents. Italics just only are animals. And so this makes it easier to look up. And also, if you're extrapolating, you're going to see things more right next to each other that look like each other. We also have the point and click interface for scoring. We have the ink blots with the locations that you can see rather than having to look them up. And we have them, we go in 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, as you can see. As in the CS, we use the same numbers, but the CS doesn't have all the numbers. This is for historical reasons. We put them in numerical order. We also have a form quality judgment form quality judgment resolution interface, where you can also, by clicking whether it's human or not or animal in the location, it narrows it down to where you would look it up in the manual. And so you can just use that interface here while you're coding instead of going back and forth through a manual, and it'll help you narrow it down to the responses that fit this particular response in the form quality table. So we convert the raw scores to percentiles and plot them on profile pages using standard scores like the WACE. And we explain how we do this, given that some scores are, of course, not normally distributed. We explain that in detail in the manual. It also makes reviewing the results quicker and easier. I'm just going to say more about that on this next slides. So here, obviously, are the structural summary results, which use the raw scores, and either you have to memorize or look up the mean scores, values, and the medians if it's not normally distributed. On these next 2 slides, we've got the RPAS results printed off in standard scores, and we have them separated into page 1 and page 2. Page 1 is the ones that have the most systematic validity support, as well as a good response process foundation. Page 2 are those with less support, but it has a good response process. And so we, as we go along, expecting to either move those from page 1 to page 2 as more research comes out, or to page 0 to move it off. And so that should be getting shorter over time, will be getting shorter over time. So this is an example of the standard scores, page 1. This is page 2, as you see, a little shorter. You'll see the mean of 100. It's in 10 standard score sort of ranges, like on intelligence tests for average and above average. We have green, yellow, red, and there's none on this profile, but over 130 are black icons. There's also a supplementary results page, which every single variable, if you're interested in looking it up, you can find the raw score and the percentile, the standard deviation. And I didn't go into detail or any about the complexity adjusted. We do in our other webinars and workshops that are longer, but if you want to, you can adjust statistically for complexity on the scoring program. You don't have to do it mentally. You can adjust it on the scoring program, and it shows you, using a regression equation, what would this protocol look like if this person scores the complexity was in the average range? And you would do that only for like really low or really high complexity. Those protocols that you get that there's hardly anything there. And you're like, well, there's hardly anything there. Given there's hardly anything there, if something stands out, it's more likely to be maybe meaningful. And those overly complex protocols, it'll give you a way to show you what that would look like otherwise. RPAS doesn't use the CS interpretive strategy. There's some idea, I had this idea, heard this idea, that it was based on research, but it's not. If you look, trace the newsletters back, you trace everything back that Exner's done, this is not based on research. So we don't have this search strategy for RPAS because it gives you a false sense of security, like this is grounded in research, what I'm doing. Also the steps in the primer, those aren't grounded in research, as well as most of the cutoff scores. I mentioned response process. Response process, like in the standards of testing, a lot of that is referred to in the educational field. It initially uses this term. Like if someone's responding to a test, maybe they didn't understand the instructions, or maybe they did something a little different that led to that score. And so you look at what went on in giving that response. And there's an article here that talks a little bit more about the response process and applies it to the space variables, space reversal and space integration. So this refers to the psychological operations that occur in the process of generating a response to a task. Like Schachtel's phenomenological approach, he says, no amount of validation of Rorschach test score meanings can substitute for what goes on in the test and its interpretation. It doesn't matter how many correlations and comparing different groups, you really need to know what is happening with this score. I'll just briefly say you can kind of compare the synthesis response to block design, where you have to analyze and synthesize the components and put them back together again, but they have some differences. So, someone's analyzed the ink blot and they put them together. They're likely to do that if they do that a lot on the Rorschach. They're likely to do that sort of more in everyday life, where they look at things and they say like, oh, how does this idea and this idea fit together? Or how does this follow that? This is just a really brief example of for form quality minus, X minus percent in the CS. I'll just state here without reading it all. It starts really concrete, sort of like, this is what happened to result in this score. They had an above average proportion of responses that were inaccurate because they didn't match the shape of the plots. And then it says, what does this translate into? And then what else might you look up related to this score? So before I move on to showing some resources, don't have that much time left, but a few months ago, I would not be presenting this material, but recently, what's called the Comprehensive System Revised came out. What's that? 2 French psychologists published what they're calling a revised CSR, that has John Exner as the first author. Just came out this year. We're just learning more about it. You might say, how could that be? Well, Doris passed away in 2019. If you'll remember, it was Doris who really wanted her husband's words preserved, as did her son Christopher, who was running the office at the time. She passed away, and these psychologists they worked with John Exner's daughter Andrea to produce and to sell this. So PAR is actually selling it. But you should know that just because a publishing company publishes something, it doesn't mean that they've reviewed everything about the test, but it is called, and it does have the copyright because Andrea holds it, of the comprehensive system. But what you need to know is that these 2 psychologists have entirely rewritten Exner's test manuals. He has none of his words left. And if you remember back to Christopher saying how they wanted his words to remain his own, it's all changed. They're all written by Andronikov and Fontaine. Fontaine was a student of Anna Andronikov's. They've made revisions that aren't based on research. I attended the one workshop they've had in Geneva, Switzerland, and about their manuals. The validity section is pretty much empty. They don't have norms for children and adolescents. And Andronikov said, I asked very few questions in the workshop. I try not to be too intrusive. But I asked her why the CS still did if they didn't. She said, John told me his children norms were not good. And I said, well, why did he not remove them? And she said, he promised me that he would later. I don't know what that means. I mean, the research council who worked with him, and he still published it. So he never said anything like that to us or in any of his publications. So the CSR, basically, I'll say, they changed a lot of things, but it's not the Exner system, not the John Exner system. It's a non-empirically based system of two French psychologists that you should be aware of what this is. When you hear this name, you'll say, oh, it's been revised. But John Exner isn't, he's first author, but it's not John Exner's system. It's unclear what's going to happen with it. I've got just a little bit more time, like 10 minutes or less, and I'm going to just briefly go over some resources. You can find these in our, if you have an account, you find it at our rpass.org, but there's a lot of things behind the scenes, so I'm just going to show you a few of them when you dig down and look for them. We're actually organizing this page a little differently right now to make it not be so busy, but in these links on the side, one, you'll find an RPAS community forum where Martin Van Hoylen is one of our assistants, answers the questions. He's really good at scoring. He loves answering scoring questions. He's really smart. And if there's anything that he doesn't know or he's not sure how to answer, he always asks us. And so it's a very active forum. It's in the RPAS account, and so it's not accessible. It's secure to discuss, even though we ask people not to include clients at PHI. This is just a very small print screen to show teaching resources. We have a little over 1,000 PowerPoints for instructors to be able to use and manipulate in their classes. And if they, we ask you not to like reproduce and sell them, for example. We have other things like cases for coding, but some other things I'll show on these next slides. There's administration practice packets in there. What are those? They're really helpful for first learning how to administer the Rorschach. If you have 3 people who are 3 students or 3 psychologists or 3 whoever who play the role that's written out of what responses to say, where to point. Then you have the examiner who's taking the record, and then you have a coach who's watching on. So once you get used to the packets, we found in our webinars that we can even do this on Zoom. If people have the ink blots and they just show the ink blot to the person who's looking on Zoom. And so this helps with practicing before you get to an actual person to start practicing the Rorschach. We have a checklist for RPAS administration. We also have an 11-page one and a shorter 2-page one that just summarizes these. And when you're learning or a student is learning, you can first review this to remind yourself what you need to do. And then when you're done, you can, or your student can review the video of what they did, and they can evaluate their own work. And so you learn from what you did, if you made a mistake, or if it looks like you might have made a mistake, but you had a reason for it, was what happened with the client that you needed to explain. There's a couple of administration videos using RPAS. There's Greg Meyer on the right and one of his students. The other one also has one of his students playing a psychiatric patient. There are free 3-hour RPAS webinars. This was in 2006, so there are some updates since it, but it includes a lot of the main, stuff that we did from the CS to RPAS. There's one that I did in 2016 also for instructors and supervisors, where I include other things like how do you pronounce the author's names, or things that you need to know as an instructor or supervisor. There's also a free 3-hour interpretation webinar for account holders that Greg did. As I said, there's the RPAS casebook by Guilford. And this casebook and our manual and the inkblots and a lot of things are also sold on the products page of our website. So to go to the end and just summarize in these last 2 slides. Okay, we talked about a lot of things, but let me just summarize the why and the what again, just very briefly, sort of like as the abstract or as the conclusions for an article. Exner passed away in 2006, unexpectedly passed away. And he willed the test to his family. And the research council tried to work with the family for 3 years, and they finally, Doris said she wanted to leave the test as it was. She doesn't know what he would do over the years. So the council continued the work with him to make some new revisions. Like I said, we knew some of the problems, we knew some of the solutions, and we wanted to be able to put that into practice. We still have our full-time jobs, and this is still a lot of work to do. We do our best. We wish we could publish a lot more and faster. So any yourself or students that you have who are interested in Rorschach research, I will just say that I'm going to be holding a couple of free webinars for people who are interested in doing research, and especially people who are Rorschach research, that is, and especially people who work in a clinical setting of some type. Like, what do you need to know or do for you or somebody else to use your data to do research? And so you can sign up for our RPAS newsletters, and when those come out, then I'll be introducing them. We need more researchers. The Rorschach does. So, as I said, many of the norms are off. Many of the CS variable stability was not supported in the systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And unfortunately, the test manual that I came to just know sort of inside and out, I never looked up all the studies though, and find out there's a lot of errors in there that really, they make it look like there's like validity for like almost everything. And there's really not. But what are the changes? An overview. Administration to address the problem of R, as it was referred to in the literature, using R-opt. It nearly eliminates also the need to re-administer, tightens the standard deviations, makes it more likely that you can know how to schedule administration. The test variables are some new, some removed, some revised, and there's some new names, the same variable, but new names to help new learners. We have new international normative reference samples. Interpretation also focuses on the response process. That has made so much easier for me to teach. The students, they get it. We describe sort of like what goes on in the response process. We now also have some like fMRI research and other kinds of eye tracking research to give you a better idea of what goes on, to what leads to the interpretation. You're not just like memorizing things that you didn't know really how to apply, like how do pair responses, influence the egocentricity index? What is the interpretations of pairs that make sense in that way? If you look back, I'll just say briefly, you'll find that in 1969, Exner initially published pairs as almost identical. It was very lower base rate. They were almost like reflections. They were twins, or these are identical. And then as it moved forward, they became just pairs. And so it's likely that's one reason why the egocentricity index wasn't having this support that he expected it to. We use plotted standardized scores, like the WACE. And training, I showed you we have lots of free learning and training materials at RPAS. We have some also others that we showed. We have an example of 100 scoring in the test manual, and we also have 10 webinars from one of our research assistants that walks through and answers questions about their scoring in 10 different videos. And we also we've had some in-person workshops. We have less now. Of course, we had none for a couple of years. We had more webinars. We can get people who are in practice easier in webinars, international folks easier, students who can't afford to travel easier. And so we found that the webinars are a keeper. Whether we're going to keep doing some in-person workshops, we are going to keep doing those webinars. The last 4 slides are the references that I told you that were going to be at the end, that each of the things that I cite in here, the references at the end. We have, RPAS has for account holders, one at a time. If you promise not to distribute it, you can get emailed an article. So we know that a lot of times people in practice and people in non-US countries are less likely to have easier access, like academics in the US, to PDFs. And so for that reason, we have a library that if you want one of these articles and you have an account, you can go in and agree not to distribute it, and you can get the article emailed to you. So at the end, you're going to have a place to give comments if you want to give some feedback. If you want to email the manager@rpas.org, this email's on the website. We also have a chat on the website that is not monitored always in real time, but someone will get back to you soon. If you want to email me and ask a question, particularly to me for some reason, it's JL Mihura, my last name, at gmail.com, JL, and then my last name at gmail.com. And I think I'm about at the end of the time. I know sometimes I went pretty quickly. I added a lot of text on there so that when I'm gone, you can go back and look at it and see what I'm referring to, hopefully. And I hope that this was helpful. I'm gonna turn here and try to figure out how to sign off. So goodbye.